There was a moment in history when war stopped being about kings and started being about contracts. For centuries, empires rose and fell on the strength of men with swords. But eventually, the sword was no longer enough. Cannons required iron. Gunpowder required saltpeter. Ships required timber, rope, credit, and insurance. Armies became supply chains. And once war became dependent on supply chains, merchants stepped into the center of power. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The arms trade did not begin with factories. It began with financing. In the late Middle Ages, European rulers were constantly at war. Not total wars of annihilation, but territorial conflicts, dynastic struggles, religious campaigns. These wars were expensive, and monarchs rarely had enough coin on hand to sustain them, so they borrowed. Italian banking families, especially the Lombards, extended credit to kings who needed to pay mercenaries and buy equipment. War was no longer just a matter of bravery. It was a matter of liquidity. By the 16th century, this relationship between finance and force became unmistakable. The Fugger family of Augsburg, one of the wealthiest banking dynasties in Europe, financed the Habsburg emperors. In 1519, Jacob Fugger provided critical funding to secure Charles Fair's election as Holy Roman Emperor. That election reshaped European politics, and it was underwritten by a banking house. The Fuggers also supplied copper and silver used in weapons manufacturing. They were not generals, they were not kings, but they influenced who wore the crown. Meanwhile, cities like Venice had built industrial arsenals long before the term industrial complex existed. The Venetian arsenal in the 16th century employed thousands of workers. It could mass-produce ships and cannons with astonishing efficiency for its time. Venice didn't just defend itself, it exported military hardware across the Mediterranean. Weapons were commodities, and commodities moved to whoever pays. By the early 17th century, Europe entered one of its most devastating conflicts, the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648. What began as a religious dispute in the Holy Roman Empire spiraled into a continental struggle involving Spain, France, Sweden, and numerous German states. It was chaos, but chaos creates demand. Demand for muskets, demand for artillery, demand for iron and powder. Sweden, under Gustavus Adolphus, became a major exporter of iron and arms. Dutch merchants supplied equipment across religious lines. Neutral traders often did business with both sides. In wartime, neutrality can be extremely profitable. If there were ever a quiet truth about conflict, it's this. Ideology may drive the soldiers, but contracts drive the supplies. The 30 Years' War devastated large parts of Central Europe. Some regions lost up to 20% of their population. But arms producers and financiers did not disappear with the smoke. They became essential intermediaries between sovereigns and survival. War had become dependent on private networks, and that dependency would only grow. By the 19th century, something changed. War did not simply require weapons, it required industrial output. The Napoleonic Wars had already demonstrated the power of mass mobilization. But the true transformation came with industrialization. Steel production scaled, railroads expanded logistics, explosives became more powerful. Warfare, once seasonal and localized, began to resemble a mechanized enterprise. In Germany, the Krupp family built a steel empire in the mid-1800s that would become synonymous with artillery. By the time of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-1871, Krupp cannons had helped secure Prussian dominance over France. Industrial metallurgy was no longer a background function. It was decisive. In Britain, firms like Vickers and Armstrong Whitworth emerged as leading arms manufacturers, supplying not just the British military but foreign governments as well. The line between national defense and international commerce blurred. Weapons were no longer crafted in small workshops. They were engineered in factories and shipped globally. Then came Alfred Nobel. In 1867, he patented dynamite, transforming the explosive power available to industry and to war. Nobel was a chemist, an inventor, and a businessman. His invention revolutionized mining and construction. It also made artillery shells and demolition vastly more lethal. When he later established the Nobel Prizes, including the Peace Prize, some historians have speculated that it was an attempt to counterbalance his legacy. The irony writes itself: fortune built on explosive force, partially redeemed through awards for peace. But by the late 19th century, the arms trade was no longer reactive. It was anticipatory. The naval arms race before World War I illustrates this perfectly. In the early 1900s, Britain and Germany competed to build the most powerful fleets in history. The launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 rendered older battleships obsolete overnight. Shipyards ramped up production. Steel output surged. Budgets expanded. Each side justified its expansion as defensive, and each expansion forced the other side to respond. This was not a spontaneous escalation. It was industrial momentum. Firms received government contracts worth millions. Workers depended on those contracts for employment. Investors depended on those firms for returns. Military capacity became embedded in national economies. And then came 1914. When World War I erupted, the scale of industrial warfare stunned the world. Machine guns, heavy artillery, submarines, poison gas, all products of industrial research and manufacturing. Governments mobilized entire economies for war production. In Germany, the Krupp works became central to artillery supply. In Britain, factories shifted to munitions production on a massive scale. In France, industrial coordination intensified. The United States initially declared neutrality, but neutrality did not mean inactivity. American banks and firms quickly began supplying the Allies with arms and goods. J.P. Morgan & Co. became the primary purchasing agent for Britain and France in the U.S., arranging billions of dollars in loans and facilitating large-scale procurement of munitions and supplies. By 1917, American financial exposure to Allied victory was enormous. When the U.S. entered the war that year, the lines between financial alignment and military involvement had already blurred. War financing was not just patriotic duty, it was balance sheet management. By the end of World War I in 1918, the relationship between government and industry had been permanently altered. War production required coordination between state planners and private firms. It required debt issuance on an unprecedented scale. It required mass propaganda to sell war bonds to citizens. Entire populations became financial participants in conflict. And here's the shift that matters. Before industrialization, war was an event. After industrialization, war became an industry. Factories did not shut down overnight. Supply chains did not dissolve. Expertise accumulated. Infrastructure remained. The capacity to produce destruction at scale became embedded in the economic architecture of nations. The financial system had adapted to accommodate it. Governments issued war bonds. Central banks managed inflationary pressures. Industrial magnates expanded their influence. Workers depended on defense contracts for wages. Investors depended on defense firms for returns. War production was no longer an emergency measure. It was structural, and once something becomes structural, it resists disappearance. The arms trade had evolved from scattered merchants selling swords to a fully integrated industrial network tied to national budgets, banking systems, and employment. It had survived religious wars, dynastic struggles, and industrial revolutions. By 1918, it was clear that modern empires did not simply wield weapons. They financed them, produced them, exported them, and built entire sectors around them. The machine had been built. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the world expected reckoning. 4 empires had collapsed. Roughly 16 million people were dead. Entire regions of Europe had been reduced to mud and steel fragments. It felt, to many, like the logical end of industrialized slaughter. Surely, after something that catastrophic, the system that enabled it would be dismantled. Instead, it was audited. In the United States, public anger simmered through the 1920s. Americans had entered World War I in 1917 after years of proclaimed neutrality. But by the early 1930s, as the Great Depression ravaged the economy, suspicion turned toward the financial relationships that preceded that entry. Had the war been inevitable? Or had economic entanglements pulled the nation into conflict? In 1934, the U.S. Senate established what became known as the Nye Committee, led by Senator Gerald Nye. Its official purpose was to investigate the munitions industry and its role in U.S. involvement in World War I. The hearings ran until 1936. Bankers were called. Arms manufacturers testified. Internal correspondence was scrutinized. The press began using a phrase that would echo through history: merchants of death. The accusation was stark. Arms manufacturers and financiers had profited enormously from the war. Companies like DuPont saw massive gains from explosives production. J.P. Morgan & Co. had arranged over $3 billion in loans to the Allies, astronomical sums for the time. The argument was not that they had started the war, it was that once war began, financial interests aligned strongly with one side's victory, and that alignment made neutrality unsustainable. It was an uncomfortable conclusion, not conspiracy, incentives. If your banks are exposed to billions in loans and your manufacturers depend on export contracts, your geopolitical posture shifts, even if no one announces it. The hearings stirred public outrage. Isolationist sentiment grew. The U.S. passed neutrality acts in the mid-1930s to limit arms sales and loans to nations at war. The intention was clear: break the financial link that had entangled America before. But systems don't unravel because of hearings. They adapt. Across the Atlantic, the 1930s were not peaceful. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, was rearming in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Industrial firms like Krupp were once again expanding production. In Britain and France, defense spending began to rise in response. Rearmament was justified as deterrence. It always is. By 1939, World War II had begun. And this time, the scale dwarfed the previous conflict. The United States, though initially neutral, became what President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Through the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, the U.S. supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allied nations with weapons, vehicles, and supplies, even before formally entering the war after Pearl Harbor. American factories roared to life. Automobile plants shifted to tank production. Aircraft manufacturing exploded. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly 100,000 aircraft per year. Defense spending surged from $1.9 billion in 1940 to over $59 billion by 1945. The U.S. economy was effectively reorganized around war production. And here's the critical point. The Great Depression ended not through austerity or theoretical reform, but through industrial mobilization. War spending functioned as fiscal stimulus. It absorbed unemployment. It expanded industrial capacity. It forged tight coordination between government planners and private contractors. It created a template. If there were a gold medal for economic irony, policymakers would still be on the podium. When World War II ended in 1945, another question emerged. Would this massive apparatus shrink? Partially, but not fundamentally. The geopolitical landscape had shifted almost immediately into Cold War tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons had been introduced. The stakes were existential. Deterrence required readiness. Readiness required production. Production required contracts. In 1961, outgoing U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered a farewell address that would become famous. He warned of the military-industrial complex, the close relationship between the armed forces, defense contractors, and political institutions. Eisenhower was not a radical critic. He had been Supreme Allied Commander in Europe during World War II. He understood military necessity, but he also understood incentives. He cautioned that this permanent armaments industry, unprecedented in American history, had the potential to acquire unwarranted influence over policy and public life. Notice what he did not say. He did not accuse specific companies of plotting wars. He did not suggest conspiracies in smoke-filled rooms. He pointed to structural alignment. When entire regions depend on defense contracts for employment, when corporations depend on long-term military procurement for revenue, when politicians depend on those jobs for votes, the system sustains itself. It becomes self-reinforcing. Throughout the Cold War, defense spending remained elevated. Companies like Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman became integral parts of the U.S. economy. In the Soviet Union, military production consumed vast portions of state resources. Arms exports became tools of influence. Client states were supplied not just with ideology, but with equipment. By the late 20th century, the global arms trade had become formalized and measurable. The United States, Russia, France, China, and the United Kingdom emerged as dominant exporters. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the U.S. alone accounted for roughly 40% of global arms exports in recent years. Weapons are sold across continents, fighter jets, missile systems, drones, all embedded in contracts spanning decades. Meanwhile, defense budgets remain among the largest line items in national expenditures. The United States' annual defense budget exceeds $800 billion. China's is estimated at over 200 billion. NATO countries collectively spend well over $1 trillion per year. War, or the preparation for it, is not an interruption of economic life. It is an economic sector. And like any sector, it has employees, shareholders, lobbyists, analysts, supply chains, and quarterly earnings reports. The arms trade no longer resembles medieval merchants selling swords to rival princes. It resembles a network of multinational corporations operating within regulatory frameworks, exporting high-technology systems under government approval. But the underlying logic remains constant. Conflict generates demand. Demand generates contracts. Contracts generate profit. Profit generates influence. Peace, on the other hand, reduces urgency. This does not mean that wars are invented purely for profit. That explanation is too simplistic. Wars erupt for political, ideological, territorial, and security reasons. But once war preparation becomes economically embedded, incentives shape responses. Budgets are defended, threats are emphasized, strategic narratives are amplified. In financial terms, the arms trade is countercyclical to peace. And here is where the modern parallel becomes unavoidable. In times of economic slowdown, governments often increase spending to stimulate growth. Infrastructure projects are common. So are defense allocations. Military budgets rarely face the same political resistance as social spending cuts. They are framed as essential, necessary, non-negotiable. Debt issuance expands to fund them. Central banks accommodate. Inflation pressures are managed, sometimes imperfectly. The financial system absorbs the cost. During global crises, from the Cold War standoffs to post-9/11 conflicts to the current geopolitical tensions, defense spending surges, markets adjust, Contractors report earnings. Investors recalibrate portfolios. War, or the anticipation of it, becomes priced in. And here is the deeper lesson. The arms trade did not corrupt otherwise pure systems. It evolved alongside the financial system itself. As states grew more complex, as economies industrialized, as credit markets deepened, the capacity to produce violence scaled with them. Money and power do not operate separately. They compound each other. The medieval banker financing a king's campaign, the 19th century industrialist forging artillery, the 20th century defense contractor lobbying for procurement, the 21st century multinational exporting advanced weapon systems. They are nodes in a continuous chain. Empires did not simply decide to fight because they could. They fought because they could afford to, and because someone ensured they could. The uncomfortable truth is not that arms merchants control history. It's that incentives shape behavior. When violence becomes scalable and financeable, it stops being exceptional. The system rewards preparation for conflict, and preparation becomes permanent. History doesn't repeat in identical form, but patterns endure. The 30 Years' War required iron and gunpowder. World War I required steel and credit. The Cold War required nuclear deterrence and trillion-dollar budgets. Today's geopolitical landscape requires advanced systems, cyber capabilities, and global supply chains. The technology changes. The logic does not. If you want to understand the modern financial system, inflation cycles, debt accumulation, fiscal priorities, global alliances, you cannot ignore the arms trade. It is woven into the architecture of state power. Financial education is not just about stocks and bonds. It's about understanding which sectors are protected, which budgets are insulated, and which incentives never disappear. Real wealth comes from seeing the structure beneath the surface. Empires didn't just fall because they fought too many wars. They fought too many wars because someone always stood ready to supply them, and because the financial system made it sustainable. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't